if you listen to Danny's show or you listen to any other podcasts and you think it's really cool and I would love to do that, my challenge to you is do it. Go start a podcast, YouTube channel, whatever medium you want to do. If you think doing something like this or your own kind of thing, just do it and make 5 episodes and see where it goes.
Thank you for coming on the show. Really honored and appreciate you coming on, especially because your show is phenomenal. And
thank you.
I love your podcast. It's so informative. It's so interesting. And I learned so much. I was literally listening to it last night. I'm like, I probably texted the links of what I was watching to like 4 or 5 different people. And I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. So thank you for what you do.
Thank you. Thank you for helping grow the show.
Yes, that's what we do around here. We grow the show.
That should be your tagline. We grow the show.
Our actual tagline is we do our research here. And the research that we did landed us with Ed Zschau's high impact entrepreneurship class.
I figured you might pull some stuff out of the archives.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's
Why?
A good find.
Thank you.
As a fellow deep researcher, I really appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Why did that class play such a pivotal role in your life?
Well, let's see. So for folks listening, Ed Zschau was an incredible person. When I intersected with him, he was a sort of guest professor, teacher at Princeton, where I went to college. He was an alum. He's not a PhD professor, but he somehow convinced the administration. So Princeton is, I think, unique among the Ivies that it doesn't have any professional schools. So there's only academic departments. Like the closest, like if you're really interested in business at Princeton, you major in like economics, but that's like there's no business school, there's no law school, there's no med school, there's no nothing. It's very like non-commercial, kind of liberal arts inspired. Somehow Ed convinced the administration that he should be allowed to come back and teach. This is also not something that like normally happens there. This class on high-tech entrepreneurship. And I think his thesis was that all these Princeton kids, and this could apply to any college at this time, this was kind of mid 2000s. All these kids don't get any exposure to tech, to entrepreneurship. Like everybody goes into investment banking, which I did. And, I want to like at least plant a seed in these kids' lives that like, hey, there is this whole world out there that you're probably not thinking about. It sounds weird to say because today entrepreneurship is like so much more broadly acceptable. But this was, Facebook had just started. Facebook started while I was in college. Social Network, the movie, hadn't been made yet. Facebook certainly wasn't a public company. Like none of this was in the air. So it kind of developed this reputation amongst students that you could only take it as a junior or senior. And most people took it senior year. It was kind of like, hey, this isn't like too hard of a class. It wasn't designed to be that. That was part of my motivation for taking it. And the other part was like, this is like a really cool experience that isn't like anything else here. And so I got into the class, I took it. I was a French literature major. The class was in the electrical engineering department. But again, Ed, it wasn't for electrical engineers. It was just like educate these Princeton kids about tech and entrepreneurship. So I took it and I was just like, I get it. It did exactly what it was intended. It opened my eyes to, whoa, technology companies are a thing. Startups are a thing. Entrepreneurship is a thing. Venture capital is a thing. I was always interested in tech. I took a bunch of computer science classes in college. I sort of effectively did a minor in it. I didn't complete the actual requirements to get a minor, but I took probably 5 or 6 classes. Like I knew that computers and computer science was a thing, but I was completely disconnected from companies around it and that it could be like a career. Like I thought, you go be like a programmer somewhere if you study computer science. So as I was taking the class, I was just like, wow, this is amazing. And the thing that I really, really thought was the most incredible about it was venture capital. Ed had I think he'd worked at DEC, Digital Equipment Corporation, like an old school, like one of the very first tech companies. And then he'd gotten into VC, among many other things he'd done. And so, he was talking about his experiences in VC, and we'd read about VC and VCs in the companies that we were studying in the class. And I was like, starting a company, that seems cool, but like being a VC, that seems really cool. So I had already gotten my job in investment banking. I went into investment banking in New York after graduation. This was spring of senior year, so that was already lined up. And inspired by the class and by Ed, you can rank when you're starting in, at least you could back then, in investment banking, what group you wanted to be in. So I was like, I ranked, the technology, media, telecom group, number one. Like, okay, this is what I want to do. Like, I'm going into investment banking, but I'll at least be kind of closer to this. Got into the TMT group, did that at UBS after school. And then when I would meet with headhunters, because headhunters, probably starting 3 months into your first year as an investment banking analyst, they start calling you and meeting with you. And it's all designed, at least back then, to get you private equity jobs. So private equity, like they would go, feed on all the analyst classes in big investment banks, and that's where they would get their junior people. So I go meet with all these headhunters and say like, yeah, private equity, that seems fine, but I really want to do early stage venture capital. Like, I know it's really hard to get into, but if you ever have a job opening in early stage VC, that's what I would love to do. And a couple of years later, by God, one of those recruiters called me, and that's how I went to Madrona. So anyway, a very long-winded story, but Ed probably doesn't even know this, but that class completely changed my trajectory, my life. Also, while I was there, Tim Ferriss was one of his alums. I've told this story before. Pause for a sec. Is this good? Am I going too long?
No, this is amazing.
Okay, this is great. Okay,
yeah.
I'll pick it back up.
You're so sweet.
So while I was in this class, spring of my senior year, this is 2007, Tim and Ed had this kind of friendship relationship, and Ed would bring Tim back to the class to give a guest lecture once a semester. And Tim Ferriss was not Tim Ferriss back then. He was just some dude. The 4-hour work week hadn't come out. And, we would have Ed ran the class like a business school case study class. So often the protagonists, the CEOs or the VCs would come sit in class with us and discuss with them. And so this one class was with Tim, and we were all like, what is this random dude doing here? He's not a founder. He's not a VC. He hasn't done anything. He had his supplement company. And I've told this before, but literally in my notes from that class, I still have it on my computer somewhere. The title, I said, supplement guy. And so Tim came and did his, guest lecture. For years, Tim would say, I'm a guest lecturer at Princeton University. And this was it.
No way.
This was the guest lecture at Princeton University. He did it every semester. Anyway, yeah. So Tim gave this lecture, and he's like, yeah, no, by the way, I'm writing this book. It's about to come out. If you go, buy the book or write I think Amazon reviews existed at that point. Write a review on Amazon. And I was like, hey, whatever. Like some dude writing a book, and turned out it was the 4-hour work week, and that was Tim Ferriss.
That's such a genius idea to do and to think about, is like, how can you, obviously most people aren't Princeton graduates, but is there a way for you to give a speech at a high impact university to, when you're growing in your career, like there's a possibility there. Like, let's say I have somebody on this podcast who's a professor. Well, maybe I form a relationship with them and then I speak at their class. Like, there's a way to hack that to gain the credibility.
Absolutely. Tim was a master at this. I mean, still, not that he needs to do this anymore, obviously, but, and again, like, this is another story that maybe to listeners, listeners who are younger, even just listeners who don't think about going back in history to that time, because this was, almost 20 years ago.
Wow.
That kind of like growth hacking, social media, like, I don't want to cast in a negative. I think it's brilliant what Tim did, but nobody was doing it. Like, it was all brand new. I mean, Twitter had just started, like literally just pivoted from Odeo into Twitter. I think it was maybe that year that they launched at South by. So like, Tim really was so far ahead of the curve in doing this stuff.
Yeah. Why did you write your senior thesis on champagne?
Oh boy. Well, so I was a French literature major, as I said, and hopefully you can get a flavor too from everything I've been saying about Princeton. It's not designed to be a commercial enterprise, and so most of the classes I took and the other work I'd done in the department, you have to do independent research work your junior year to kind of prepare for the senior year, was all very academic. I focused on mostly what I studied was 17th century French theater. That was like my jam. By the time senior year rolled around, I knew like I was not going to be an academic. I was kind of done with school. I got my investment banking job. I wanted to go into business. And so I was like, okay, what can I write about that will satisfy the requirements so that I can graduate here in my department, but also be kind of like a interesting business learning experience. And I somehow convinced my advisor, who his specialty was 17th century French theater, right? Like to let me do this. And so I wrote this thesis about the champagne industry, and it was really interesting at the time. Mostly what I wrote about, sort of the first half of the thesis was the history of the champagne industry and Dom Perignon, who was a monk, who there's all this myth and legend about how champagne was invented, and part of the legend is that he invented it. He probably didn't invent it, but there's all this cool history behind it.
Wait, Dom Perignon is a monk? Or was?
He was a monk.
That is crazy.
Yes. And
because alcohol is like the furthest thing that you would expect a monk to drink.
Well, you would think so, but I think also probably they were pretty bored and living celibate lives, and so they're just in these monasteries, and like you got to do something to make it interesting.
Wow.
Anyway, I can't remember the details, but there's all this stuff about so Champagne is a region in France. It's a winemaking region, and they were famous for white wine at this time, and they would export it, and they'd make it at the monasteries, and so at Dom Perignon, the monk, was part of the winemaking operations at his monastery, and they'd export it. And customers in England, in particular, really liked this white wine from the Champagne region. And supposedly, because of it's the 1700s we're talking about here, imperfections in some yeast often would get left in the finished wine bottles when they'd export them, and then they'd take a while to sail across the channel, and then they'd sit in cellars in England, and then when the British, consumers of this champagne wine would open it, it would be fizzy because the yeast had restarted fermentation. Anyway, we are way off topic here, but this is great.
This points to what I think one of your core competencies and skills are, which is your ability to recall information. I'm asking you to recall something that you probably wrote 20 years ago, and you're able to give the nuance and detail of that. When did you first notice you had that skill?
Ooh. We cut all the silence.
Or not. We could keep the silence in.
Or we could keep the silence. So usually when we have guests on Acquired, one of the things we do, we tell them to get them comfortable. We're like, hey, take all the time you want to answer. You can even outline your answer. We're going to cut all the silence. But this is great. You're handing me the pad. Thank you.
Did you see the Lex and Elon Musk 20-second or 30-second silence that happened? That was fascinating.
That's fun. I don't know that I saw that one. I did see Elon did that CNBC interview. And there was the long silence when I think it was David Faber was doing the interview, asked him, like, hey, dude, like you tweet all this crazy stuff. Like, do you ever think about that? Then there was the long silence of like, okay. So the question is, when did I first notice this? Honestly, I don't think I noticed this until a few years into doing Acquired.
Wow.
Like specifically noticed, but clearly you can tell from talking to me, this is just who I am. Like, I love this. I've been doing this my whole life. But I never thought of myself as like a storyteller or recalling this stuff. Like I said, until years into Acquired, we'll get into the whole journey. But the idea that this would become my profession was the farthest thing from my mind for most of my life so far.
Yeah. Well, I also can't help but notice the similarities of both of us, where your parents are both attorneys, and they also started their own law firm when you were 2 years old. And it's like, my parents.
There's the research. There it is.
My parents, both attorneys, started their own law firm when I was 3. So the fact that like this to be doing this is like in our blood in some sense. Like when I heard you say that, I had like tears in my eyes
Oh,
because I'm like, the ability to research, to learn about something, and then to talk to that person about that thing is like, it's a skill that must just be in both of us in some respect.
it must be. Maybe there's something to like our dinner table conversations growing up. Maybe it's
Mm-hmm.
just innate. I didn't know that. That is quite uncanny. So I have heard you talk about your parents wanted you to like go down a traditional path. Like, how was your experience with them? Because similar for me.
Yeah. I mean, if you have parents who are attorneys and who succeed in the old world, you're likely going to be pushed down that path in some respect. But my parents are open-minded enough to understand that what the way they did it might not be the way that people do it today. And so it's kind of been a push and a pull of like, no, I think I know the right way. And then they're like, well, do you really? And then I'll be like, well, here's an example. And then they'll be like, oh, here's a opposite example. So it's kind of been that push-pull since I didn't go the traditional route at all. But you did in some sense of like investment banking, even venture capital. You're working for a big firm that like your parents can tell to other people, be like, oh, look, David's doing good work. And look, he's a productive member of society. So,
well, the funny thing is, even that, for my parents, and I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia, again, miles away culturally and everything and physically from Silicon Valley. The idea of like, even going to investment banking, that was like, okay. But then like venture capital, moving to the West Coast, like that was, that was by far an adult at this point in time. They kind of, had no say in and supported me and let me do whatever I want. But like, they were very much scratching their heads like, what is David doing? And then when I was like, yeah, I'm going to stop doing that and I'm going to do a podcast. It took them a few years to come around on that too.
So what do you think the core skill that you got from them to do what you're doing today has been?
Well, I think there's two things I would say. One, definitely a love of history, researching, understanding sort of the like how the why of like why things played out the way they did in history. Not necessarily about, the law, I guess, although that kind of is embedded in, arguments you're making in the courtroom and whatnot. But my dad especially is a huge history buff. And so we would talk about history all the time. I loved history in high school. So that's kind of one aspect. I think that helps seed the storytelling, history, discovering like, wow, this cool thing that like you never would have known about. The other thing too is totally related to them starting their own law firm when I was little. And they had a few other even more successful entrepreneurial ventures, although they didn't think about it that way, that we could talk about growing up. But I kind of saw from them, they were big firms. They led this. I was too young to know, but I kind of heard this. They were big firms in Philadelphia. They left, they started their own firm, just the two of them. Like the idea of risk or like not following a traditional path, even though ironically then they were like, you should go to law school, and you not go. But like what I observed from their actions was like, you can take risk, you can do kind of crazy stuff and it'll all work out.
It's fascinating that you had the perspective of like, this is entrepreneurship and this is entrepreneurship working. And they didn't view it that way. Because my parents also don't view it that way.
I don't know if it's a lawyer thing or just like, that's funny. So they started their own firm too.
Yes. When I was 3.
But they don't view it as a entrepreneurial venture.
Correct. And taking risks. I think it's because entrepreneurship in a different era, maybe 30 years ago, was looked down upon in society. And law was looked up upon, and that was a profession that was admired. And I think there's a lot to be said about how you and me, in some respect, in a much less. I'm pushing the conversation in terms of entrepreneurship being cool and showing that the benefits of it in a much less way than you guys are.
No, you're doing it in a big way. You're already big. You're going to keep getting bigger.
But that's an incredible thing that you guys are doing. To me, is like you're opening up the Overton window for the conversation of entrepreneurship, which is an incredible thing.
Yeah, the normalization. I mean, if anything, I love this conversation. I hadn't quite thought about it like this, but the normalization of entrepreneurship has been just like, I think, a huge through line of society and industry in the last 20, 30 years, like, and my life too, like, and yours too. Like, we are riding this wave.
Absolutely. And so one thing that I discovered upon doing research for this was the connection between Hollywood and venture capital. And that is closely aligned with entrepreneurship as well. I never viewed those two things as similar before doing research for this conversation. Why are they similar?
Well, they weren't for a long time. Or at least nobody explicitly thought they were. However, there were always a lot of parallels, and now there are a lot of very explicit parallels. There were implicit parallels to start, and then explicit parallels. You might be, I'm imagining some of the research you did for this is our conversation with Michael Ovitz.
Yes.
And our series on Andreessen Horowitz, too, the venture capital firm.
Linked below. Such good episodes.
Man, Michael is a character, that guy. The most amazing thing about interviewing him, it was a great conversation. And, CAA and his story, and then kind of being the inspiration for Andreessen Horowitz is huge. But the whole time behind him on Zoom is this, piece of art on the wall behind him. So I think he's on the board of the MoMA in New York, like the New York MoMA, like
wow.
Probably the most preeminent modern art, institution in the world. And I'm just looking at it. I think we looked it up afterwards. I can't remember what it was, but it's like, that's like, I don't know, it's worth $10, $20 million. Like some priceless piece of art just like right behind his head the whole time. Incredible. So yeah, in the early days, so Hollywood, there's an amazing book called The Genius of the System by, Schatz is the last name of the author. Robert Schatz, maybe? I'm blanking on his first name. It's an incredible book. It was recommended to me originally by Mitch Lasky, who was a partner at Benchmark. He's now retired and does the Gamecraft podcast with Blake Robbins, which is an amazing podcast focused on the gaming industry. And he and Blake started that partially with that book as their inspiration of like, what that book does for early Hollywood and what they want to do for Gamecraft is tell the business side of the story, because the art gets so elevated, like the movies, the games, that's what everybody talks about. But like how and why the movies get made the way they did and games get made the way they do is dictated by like by my acquired co-host Ben put it great in our interview with Blake and with Mitch, as the channels that the art has to flow through. Anyway, so this great book, highly recommend it. But back in the old days, the old Hollywood system, it was the studio system. So these studios, you think the legendary ones, MGM, Warner's, what would become Paramount, Universal, etc. We kind of vaguely think of these as big Hollywood entities. Today, they're very different. Back then, it was all vertically integrated. So they were, actors were on contract with the studios. If you were Jimmy Stewart or Greta Garbo or, you were an employee of a studio. And then all of the means of production and all the financing, it was all in these, houses. They were almost like, we did a great episode on LVMH, like these luxury brands, these luxury houses, fully vertically integrated. And obviously that is different than early venture capital. But as a result, the economics of it were that the studios made all the money. Like the actors got paid fine, but they weren't making what Tom Cruise is making now. And really, Ovitz was a big part of changing the game to elevate the actors and the directors to really get huge shares of the economics in Hollywood. And similarly, we'll talk in a sec, that has happened in venture capital. So early venture capital, money was the scarce resource. So it wasn't vertically integrated like Hollywood, but the VCs owned the companies more or less effectively. Like founders, entrepreneurs, they would, by the time a company would go public, companies would only raise a couple rounds. They would be diluted down to very, very minority stakes if they were still around at all. A lot of firms like Don Valentine at Sequoia was most notorious for this, is like, if you founded a company, within a year or two of Don coming in, you're out. Like, fire the founder. That was like step number one in the playbook. The old VC playbook was fire founders as soon as possible, which is completely nonsensical. But that's kind of how the point was, all the power was with the institutionalized entities, studios in Hollywood's case, venture capital firms in early VC and startup land. And then both, Hollywood and startups have now obviously gone in the opposite direction, where the power and the economics lies with the creators, for lack of a better term, the directors, the actors, and the founders, and the employees on the startup side.
It's funny because the world of creators follows that very closely as well, where it's like the power is accruing to the actual people who are making the thing as opposed to the people financing the thing, probably because the costs have gone down dramatically, so that anyone can create a podcast, anyone can create a radio show. And
we absolutely got to talk about this. This is the creator world, YouTube, podcasting, et cetera, is the most extreme version of this. So what's your corporate structure? Do you own the podcast 100% yourself?
Yes.
Yeah. Ben and I 100% own Acquire. We've never raised any money. Why would we raise any money?
Yes.
There are no other shareholders, and yet we built like a pretty big business. And then other folks like, Doug DeMuro in the YouTube side, or, like the My First Million, plenty of other people have built big businesses as creators with no outside capital, no outside involvement. And it used to be not that long ago that was not the case. You wanted to do this, you had to be part of Vox, or you had to be part of the New York Times, or you had to do, it was really, Ben Thompson, I think, was like one of the very first people to be like, I think I can build a media company myself.
When did you notice that opportunity?
Well, it was completely organic. So Ben and Ben, my co-host and partner on Acquired, we didn't intend for this to be a business. We didn't intend for it to be anything more than just an excuse for, we were friends and an excuse to hang out.
Well, he pitched it to you, right?
Yes. He pitched it to me. Essentially as that. This was in 2015. He was interested in podcasting. He listened to podcasts and was like, this would be fun to do together. It would be a good excuse to get out. We didn't think about anybody listen, anything. We did it for a couple of years with no sponsors, no business model whatsoever. It was the farthest thing from our minds. And then this is great. I can tell the specifics of the story publicly now. It will become obvious why I can now tell this publicly. I believe it was like late 2017, early 20s, sometime between 2017 and 2018. I think I had the idea, because I remember Ben was kind of resistant to this, if I remember it right. I was like, we should bring on a sponsor. Not because I thought we should make money from Acquired, but because I thought it would make the show more legitimate. Especially if we had the right sponsor and the right brand, it would make it look like we're more of a thing. Maybe borrowing a little from Tim Ferriss here. So we went to, we were VCs at the time. We were at Madrona. I think Ben had left and started at PSO, Pioneer Square Labs, now Pioneer Square Ventures. But I was still at Madrona. And so we had, we knew the folks at Silicon Valley Bank. They were our bank. They banked all our companies. And they did a lot of, sponsorship of events and stuff like that. So we went to the guy who ran SVB's Seattle operations. We're like, hey, would you sponsor us? And we're like, it's not about the money. Like, literally, you can pay us whatever you want. Like, we just want to have SVP's brand on the show.
You told them that. This is actually genius. I need to start thinking about brands that would improve the credibility of my show. This is so smart.
Totally. Oh my gosh. Well, it's just smart. Like, it wasn't intentional. So, he said it was kind of a tough process. He was like, this is 2016, like podcasts. It was so much smaller than it is now. I remember some stats from this time, because Ben had looked at starting some companies around podcasting when he moved over to Pioneer Square Labs. We ultimately did start one that we can talk about. The entire podcasting industry in terms of revenue around this time. Now, obviously, it was big. People listened to them, but nobody thought of like a business. Like, the entire revenue of the whole industry was like $30 million with an M. Like, you know.
To put it in perspective, what is it today? I want to say there was $10 billion of advertising, and radio was $40 billion. If I have the numbers correct, how does that sound?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds. Let me put it this way: we're still a little ways off from that, but like, I fully believe, and like, you know, God willing, I'll still going, you know, up and to the right as we go. At some point, pretty soon, acquired will eclipse that in just our revenue. Like that.
Eclipse what?
What the whole industry was when we
Wow.
started. Like,
Wow.
that is. You know, it's not unreasonable to think that. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So back to SVB. We, you know, it was like not controversial, but like he had to kind of stick his neck out a little bit with corporate to do this. Be like, hey, you know, David's at Madrona. They're like an important customer. Like, let's. So we landed on. They paid us $5,000 to sponsor our first season. That's when we introduced seasons on Acquired. There were no seasons before that. We were like, okay, we got to have some, you know, we can't just be like SVB sponsored. What are they sponsoring? Like, they'll sponsor the season. And I think I could go back and look at this. I think that first season was maybe like 20 episodes or something like that. Oh boy. So they paid us $5,000. We think this is great. We get the great, you know, brand association with Silicon Valley Bank, you know, at the time, incredible. And then it had been running for either 6 months or a year. And I think Ben had the idea like, oh, we should survey our audience, and we'll just learn a ton, get a ton of feedback about the show. But now that we have a sponsorship, we should like, just curious, how did it perform? So we said, you know, 2 or 3 episodes at the top of the show, we said like, hey, we're running, you know, our annual audience survey. Click this link, you know, respond. We did a little Google form. And we had a bunch of questions in there. And one of the questions was, Silicon Valley Bank has been our sponsor this season of Acquired. Have you or your company started a banking relationship with SVB? And if so, during this time, and if so, did hearing about them on Acquired, you know, was that in part or whole responsible for you choosing SVB? I think we had about, this is a weirdly specific thing. I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe we had 688 respondents to the, like, replies to the survey. Mm-hmm. Our audience size was, I don't know, maybe 10, 20,000 at the time. And of those 688 people, something like 30, 31, 32 said yes in response to that question. So just of the sample size, we hear like 30 people that we know they started a banking relationship. So then we asked some friends at SVB. We're like, well, what's your LTV on a new startup banking relationship? And they're like, oh yeah, let me ask around. They gave me $500,000 per new banking relationship.
What?
So that was the moment when we were like, oh wow. Oh wow. There is a lot more to what we're doing than we even realize.
Dude, that is crazy. So you generated what? 10 times 500,000 would be $5 million times 6 or times 3. So you generate $15 million.
No, hypothetically. Hypothetically,
for
yes,
the
lifetime value for,
which is even funnier now.
And now I can tell the story because SVB doesn't exist anymore. For years, we couldn't tell the story. But and it's also funny that like that was the marquee brand that, you know, we wanted to have be a part of Acquired. It still is a great brand, and they were a wonderful bank. They were our bank for Acquired for many years. Anyway, I loved all those people. But yeah, that moment we were like, okay, wow. So we should rethink what we're doing here.
So from that moment on, you go to other banks or you go to SVB and you're like, listen, you got to pay us a lot more if we're.
Well, so you know, entrepreneurship is a journey, right? Like, and again, we were very unintentionally entrepreneurs here. A couple things happened. So again, we weren't yet thinking that big. Also, the whole market, the podcast market had to come along. The startup market itself and the venture market still had a long way to grow from where it was back then, even not, you know, we're talking 5-6 years ago. So the first thing we did is the first thing we could think of, like, oh, we'll go to the law firms too. You know, we got the banks, we'll go to the law firms now. So I think we went to Wilson Sonsini, Perkins Coie, cool. I don't know the Cooley ever sponsored, but like those, you know, the startup law firms, that was the natural.
That's funny.
So they, few of those sponsored. SVB continued for a bit. Interestingly, what happened with SVB, we always were so appreciative of them for, like, we never would have learned any of this without them. So we did, I think if I remember right, I could be wrong on this, I think the most we ever charged them for a slot was maybe $20,000. Part of it was we had started so low and we were very appreciative to them. The other part of it, the bigger part though, was in their minds, we were this like, little thing that they could never think of us as like a big business that would be worth spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on, because it just, that wasn't who we were to them.
They were anchored so low.
They were anchored so low. Yeah. And it's like it's almost like I'm sure you've experienced this, and everybody listening, like, this happens a lot when you're younger in high school or college, or you interact with somebody when you're 15.
They still have in your head that you're 15.
Right. You're the intern or you're the 15-year-old. And then now you're so much more than you were 15. But in their mind, you're still, 15-year-old Danny.
And I think that, honestly, that plays a role in parenting as well, where they can imagine you at such earlier stages that they can't update their image fast enough to how you're growing.
Totally. Yeah. It's something as a parent now myself, it's something I think about a lot. And it's my daughter's she's just about 2. And like at this age, they're changing so fast you can't. But at a certain point, the rate of change slows. And I think that's when it happens. Anyway, yeah. So SVB. So we did the law firms. And then who was our first big sponsor? Maybe Tiny might have been our first kind of them breaking out of that. Tiny's been a long-time sponsor. They're a current sponsor. Love those guys. They're, Andrew and the whole crew there. They're just a dream. And they have, unlike SVB, I think maybe because we found them a little bit, also they're entrepreneurs themselves. It's a very different type of organization. They've updated their mental model of us as we've gone along. But what the business is today is growth stage private companies, B2B SaaS, growth stage private companies. That's our sweet spot. So Vanta, Pilot.com, Modern Treasury, Vouch. I think all of these companies are YC alums. It's like once you get to your B2B, high LTV B2B SaaS company, you're at Series C, D, et cetera. You're kind of establishing market leadership. That's our core sponsor sweet spot now.
Yeah. And I think in part it's because your audience is the most valuable audience in the world of CEOs, entrepreneurs, high-level executives. Like, all those people are interested in your show and listening to your show, hence making the valuable ad slots incredible. Like, it's insane.
Totally. Yeah. The way we think about it is there are, really kind of 4 segments to our audience. There's founders, CEOs and founders. That is probably the single biggest segment. There's investors in aggregate. And interestingly to us, we started in VCs as investors, and that probably is still the largest population of investors, but it's now all the way up and down the stack. So like VCs, hedge funds, private equity, mutual funds. We have a lot of institutional LPs, like endowments. So that's kind of the second biggest. Then the other segment is sort of like other people, general interest people, maybe some of whom work in tech, but they're really in the 4th bucket, like our parents and the like, and their friends. That's probably the smallest bucket. But then the 4th bucket, I think actually is probably the most valuable for us. That's future CEOs and investors. And that's people working at startups today, that's students, et cetera. And obviously our sponsors and we want to reach the first 2 buckets, but they also want to reach that 4th bucket.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. How do you think about creating for that next generation of people and what those people need? I mean, all of it, it's interesting to me when I see so many 13 to 17-year-olds listen to this podcast, because I'm like, I'm onto something here.
Yeah.
Because those are the people who are going to be the future creators, the future entrepreneurs that are leading the world. How do you think about that bucket?
Yeah, totally. Well, and that's that's a secret too, not a little, that's a big secret that I think most people, now it's again more widely known and accepted, but especially in slightly earlier times, those were worthless, like student. But like you know what I have in my mind about this is, do you remember the company SoFi? They still exist.
Yes.
They were social finance was the SoFi. They were one of Chamath's SPACs during the most recent bubble. Anyway, totally fine company. I think I believe they're still an independent public company. When they first started, what the first product was and the thesis of SoFi. I remember this. I was in business school at the time, and the founder had been at GSB, and it was kind of a sort of GSB type Stanford type company. Was student loans, originating student loans, but discriminating, for lack of a better word, based on the university and your major. And their kind of like insight was like, hey, a student loan to a liberal arts major at maybe even Princeton like me, but XYZ university, a liberal arts major, is versus a student loan to a computer science major at Stanford. Like, these are very different risk profiles. And at the time, nobody else, like, it was just a standard, student loan industry was everybody gets the same loan. Now there's maybe some social merits to that, but like just from a pure financial risk perspective, very different. And so, but I think that mindset applied to a lot of people back then, like, oh, young people, students, like whatever. But like, no, young people and students who are listening to this show, they're going to do something incredible. Like a very, very high percentage of them, of you all listening, of, you probably were this person not that long ago. I was this person not that long ago. Like, they may look like kids, but they're going to be the next Brian Chesky's, Jensen Huang's, Michael Moritz, like what have you.
Yeah, this was something I learned from listening to the Taylor Swift episode, was just how much she was looked down upon because she was 14 years old and a talented person. But because she was 14, she was looked at in this way.
Right.
Did you feel a sense of connection to her when you were thinking about your own journey of like, wow, was I looked down upon in that? I mean, you went to Princeton, so it's not like you were that looked down upon.
No. I had well, Taylor's a really interesting story too. Like, in many ways, if you know anything about, if you know a little bit about Taylor Swift's background and history, the kind of narrative about her is she was born starting on third base. She had a very wealthy family. Her dad was a wealth manager. She was born not too far from me in Pennsylvania, actually, and then the family moved to Nashville to support her career. Like, the early days of Taylor with the country accent, like, that is a fake country accent for sure. It's great. She took some lessons from Tim Ferriss, shall we say. But like, they had the resources to do that, you know. But what you hit on is such a good point. Like, yes, all that is true. But she broke into the industry at 13, 14, and everybody thought she was this like little country singer, and like, she had big ambitions beyond that and talent level way beyond that. And she really had to fight to like, be the songwriter, like own her songwriting rights. And then, if it took her, freaking Taylor Swift, it took her 20 years to get to the point now where she's owns her recording rights too. Like, crazy. Anyway, so no, I had a very different experience than that. I don't identify with that. Like, I was also born on third base, went to freaking Princeton, did investment banking, did venture capital, like, no, it was much later in life when I went full time unacquired, that's when I felt like, and it was a pretty brief window, but, my friends, peers, kind of like, okay, David's like doing something freaking crazy here. Like, this is he's throwing his career away. This is insane. Like, do we need to stage an intervention? Like,
Do you feel guilty for your privilege?
That's a good question. Not actively, maybe I should. Certainly so many other people, didn't have all the advantages that I had growing up. And it goes way back even before Princeton. Like, I went to private school. I went to a great private school, like blah, blah, blah. I was an only child. I had so much attention, resources. And other people don't have that, and often, I think as a result, don't have the same opportunities and don't end up, succeeding. But I think if I look back on it, I probably feel a little guilt about like the getting into Princeton, investment banking, probably ultimately getting into VC too. Like that was a lot of privilege, especially like the getting into Princeton. That was going to private school, being an only child, having lots of resources, absolutely got me into Princeton. And then that opens the door, gets so many more opportunities. The acquired thing though, and by far, the most success I've had financially and otherwise in my career is from acquired. I think because we took the risk and like we built it all ourselves. Like, so that I feel no guilt about. And that's been an interesting journey too. In those early days, we felt a little guilty about taking sponsorships, bringing money into this equation. And then as we started raising our prices, we felt a little, and now I'm just like, I don't think about it price. I think about it as value. Like, oh, we have a lot of value. We have a huge audience. It's a very valuable audience, and we built that. So,
yeah, it's a funny thing, and it's interesting how you described yourself as like not the best student, and I wonder like why was that when you were clearly so smart and you could have. It seemed like been a great student. You are a great student when you're doing acquired, and I relate to you on this of just like not understanding the opportunities that I was given at that time. But why do you think personally you were not a great student?
Yeah. Not a great, I'm just your research is so good. Because I feel like I've said that elsewhere. Yeah, I was not a good student. And that thesis I wrote on champagne, like, I just gave you all the reasons I did it. And I probably learned something from it and I can remember it, but like, it was not good. It was not good. I think I got like a B or a B- on it, which, for your senior thesis, like you got to try hard not to get an A on your senior thesis. But that kind of, I was very much, once I got in, I worked really hard in high school. And once I got into Princeton, I really coasted. And I feel guilty and regret that. It is so funny though now, like, I was really not a hardworking student, especially in college. And now I feel like I work so much harder than 99.99999% of the population at research and like all the things I was supposed to be doing in college. Life is funny like that. How do you feel about it?
I feel like I'm the type of person, and I wonder if you are as well, that if it's for myself, I will go to the end of the world. Yeah. But if I'm doing it for other people or what someone else wants me to do, I'm not going to do it. If someone else chose the guests for me, I would not be able to do the research. If someone else said, you have to do this and this, I wouldn't. It's just impossible. Like,
you're so right. You're so right. And I don't know if that's a universal thing or if that's like a personality thing that I definitely share that with you. Excuse me. I was talking with this is third hand, talking with another friend, another podcaster in our industry. He was talking about yet another person who I don't know, another show in our industry. And they did, one of these crazy deals with not with Spotify, but like, a deal like that in this most recent bubble. Made a lot of money. Big dollar value deal. Very top podcast. And this person I was talking to is, you friends with the creators and the team there. It's like, they're miserable, like, cause you go from, you run the ship, you're not just the captain of the ship, you are everything on you are the ship. Like there's no, I don't know about you, we have no employees. We have our audio engineer, our editor, who's amazing, but like there's nobody else. We do everything. To then you've got a big corporation telling you what to do. Like, oh my God, I would die.
Yeah. That's like, I'm sure you notice this time and time again when you're doing the research for acquired, where it's like the people who have the most fun, the entrepreneurs, are usually in the early stages of it or maintain ownership of their thing. And then once they sell it or they have to report to somebody, it's just not as fun. Have you noticed that? It
kills the magic for sure. Not for everybody. There are, I do think this is a more personality driven thing. I think there are people out there like me, sounds like you're the same way, that like, it would kill the magic. And interestingly, like, I think those personality types used to get, people like us used to get pigeonholed in the like eccentric, crazy founder. I don't think I'm particularly hard to work with. You're amazing to work with, but it's like the innate motivation. But then there are founders out there who can go through every stage. And there are founders out there who maybe their company gets acquired and then they take on a big role at the new company and maybe end up leading the new company. Like that happens. Sort of the most impressive. You had tweeted last night about what's your favorite acquired episode, and talked to David about it. I think I was like, oh, I'm going to think about that. And I replied, our NVIDIA series and Jensen Huang is that for me. Like Jensen is just this amazing. He has gone through every stage. He's maintained control, and he is the CEO, and he is still to this day, he is, killing himself. I'm sure he doesn't think about it. He thinks it's really fun, but like he is at the wheel, actively running one of the most important companies in the world that he started 40 freaking years ago, or not 40, almost 40 years ago. And he's been doing it every stage of the way.
It's so crazy that I'm what comes to mind for me is Dana White in the UFC and Joe Rogan talking about how Dana White has the worst job in the world, but he believes it's the best job.
Right.
And that makes it the best job.
Right.
And it's like what we do to a lot of people looks probably like the worst job in the world. They're going through all these people and these companies and they're looking at it and they're reading it and they're listening to podcasts. I would never want to do that. And it's like, to me, that's the most fun, right? To you, that's the most fun.
Totally. Well, it's funny. There's a, I'm curious how your experience has been over the past few years. There's been a big change, I think, especially in how younger people view what we do. My wife works with teenagers. She's the more or less the right analogy is the principal of the ballet school here at San Francisco Ballet. So if you're training to be a professional ballet dancer, like a world-class professional ballet dancer, this is one of the, 5 or so schools in the world you would go to. So the kids from all over the world, they come, they live here in San Francisco, they train, and Jenny runs the administrative part of the school. So she interacts with all these teenagers all the time. And, she said this to me, this is like, I think a stat out there. And she's like, this bears out in these kids that I talk to, they want to do what we're doing. Like, this is the number one, job that kids want these days is be a, creator. Mm-hmm. So I think that is changing, but I think also what people don't realize and what you're alluding to with the less glamorous part is, while there are many ways to be a creator, probably the surest fire recipe for success is to do more research than anybody else, work your ass off. Like, this is really fun, but you did a lot of work to prepare for this conversation. And I think that's what people don't see as much.
Yeah. Well, to me, that is the fun part. And
right.
You have to love
to love doing that, or you will stop.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that it's an important thing to point out and note in a world where you only see the externally facing things, but the internally facing things are really the things that are either going to make or break you from doing the activity.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've found this would be fun to riff on. I have also found a different source and level of motivation for the research and the work. And I'm curious if you've had a similar experience. So it for sure started with just we started as a hobby, and then I started doing more research on the history because I just liked it, and that was it for a long time. But there is a new thing that's happened internally from my motivation for researching for episodes, which is fear-based in a good way, or at least I think in a good way. I now, and I know Ben and I talk about this a lot, I know he feels the same way. We feel when we're doing an episode, like if we don't deliver, if we don't tell the best version of this story that's ever been told, that's what people expect. That's what we expect of ourselves. Mm-hmm. And if we don't deliver on that, there's a fear that everything could go away, people stop listening, and then our livelihoods would disappear. But I think it's even more than that too. It's just I feel like we didn't, it's like a missed opportunity, or we didn't do what we were capable of. I don't know if you feel that way.
You know your own level of talent and your own level of capability, and the audience also knows it.
Yeah.
And therefore, the bar is raised on yourself.
Yeah.
This is why Seth Godin told me he stopped going out in public, was because he believed that every time that he was interacting with somebody, that person expected him to be the person he was on stage. And that led him to be so scared that, imagine someone meets you in the street and you don't have a great story. Like, I personally wouldn't give a shit. But
Yeah,
like,
right. Yeah. No, I love it when people say hi. Ben and I were in New York a couple of weeks ago. This is the most amazing thing. This has happened in little bits before, but we're like, oh wow, we were in New York for 3 or 4 days, maybe, just doing some meetings and stuff, and we're walking around the city in New York. Like, we live on the West Coast. He's in Seattle. I'm in San Francisco. And probably 15, 20 people stopped us on the street and are just like, whoa. And it was great.
you're a celebrity, man. Like, isn't that crazy? Because that
So
would be
crazy.
so far to imagine, I'm sure, 5 years ago.
Right. I didn't even think of myself as a podcast. I was a venture capitalist back then, you know?
Well,
I mean, is this happening to you? This has got to be happening to you too.
Yeah, it's really crazy when someone stops you while playing your podcast. That's that's the craziest thing. But for you, it's not like this was so obvious all along. I mean, in 2020, you guys went through a new branding and was like, we're gonna change up the show. And
oh yeah, oh boy, yes.
It's like that's not that long ago in the grand scheme of things.
That was our so much to talk about. So when COVID happened, what you're referring to is we changed the name of the show to Adapting from Acquired.
Acquired to Adapting.
I know. That was a really bad idea. It's so, I don't know if you feel this way. There's so many things that happened, especially during that early COVID time, that you look back and you're like, man, that was a bizarro universe. Like, it's just cringy to look back at like the things that I said, people said were happening, and just like, wow, we all lost our minds for like a set of months. Yeah, we thought it would be a good idea to change the name and style of the show to, instead of, doing whatever it is we do on Acquired, which basically is just tell great stories in as deep and as long a way as humanly possible, to know we're going to only tell shorter stories of companies and people who have adapted to difficult times. It was like we took there's this aggregate thing about our show that I think is the magic of the whole thing. We're like, no, we're going to cut off this very little bit and we're going to make it only that. It was just a terrible idea.
But it sounds like a good idea based on the circumstance and how people were, people aren't going to worry about being acquired anymore. We're going to worry about adapting to new circumstances because that's what society and culture was.
That was the logic at the time.
So it sounds
and I can say it was stupid
luck.
because it was my idea and I convinced Ben to do it.
and so take us through when you realized that wasn't working anymore, because people might be in that position right now of pivoting and then being like, all right, actually the pivoting wasn't working. We should go back to the old thing.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember exactly how it went. And we kind of I think two things happened simultaneously. One, those episodes weren't very popular. I think we did 3 of them, maybe 3 or 4. And two, we also, I don't want to speak for Ben. I also felt, and he at least didn't disagree with me, so he probably felt the same way. We're also a little wait a minute. Starting to get that cringy feeling about what we had been doing. Oh, maybe this wasn't a great idea. So then we pivoted back to exactly what we were doing before. The reason why it was just a really dumb idea on my part, again, there was COVID, the whole world was turned upside down, but in a vacuum, was we had something that was really working and really growing. And then we were like, no, let's change it. It's very rare to find something that is really working. And if something is really working and still on that growth curve, by God, don't change it, So for other people, if you're listening, you're in a similar situation, by all means, if you have something that's working and you changed it and it's not working, go back to what was working. But I think a lot of pivots, though, are hey, something's not working. And then that's a lot harder. You got to figure out okay, nothing is working. Now let's go figure out something that is working. That's harder to do.
I wanted to talk to you about parenting.
Oh, yes.
Particularly
my favorite topic.
You tweeted about how parenting makes you 10 times more of who you already are, which I think is a great insight that I've never heard before, because usually people talk that way about fame and money being an amplifier of your personality. But parenting is an unusual one for me to hear about.
I love it. I'm so glad you brought this. So this is my personal pet psychology theory. So there's no research phase. This is just purely my own observation from my lived experience with friends and acquaintances and myself. Okay, here's my theory on it. and I have a almost 2-year-old now. When you become a parent, I mean, everything people say about it is absolutely true. It's the most amazing thing in the world. You have no idea that you are capable of this like amount of love. Like it just, and this doesn't happen for everybody. It happened for me. Like especially I think with dads, sometimes this happens, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's gradual, sometimes it's immediate. For me, the moment my daughter was born, I was just like, oh my God, like just the more love than I've ever felt in my whole life. And I still feel like just about that same degree of love, like every single day when I'm with her. It's just the best. But once, after you become a parent, like time becomes the most precious commodity for a bunch of reasons. One of which, and maybe the most important in the long term actually, is like I at least immediately realized my time with this person that I love so much is limited. She's gonna leave me. Like it's gonna happen. And that's the goal, I mean, hopefully we still have a relationship after she, moves out of the house, but it's never going to be like it is now. And so that's like one major perspective change. But then there's also just like the reality of like, before my wife, Jenny, and I were together, we met in college. We've been together almost 20 years now. So I think we were together probably at least 15 years before we had our daughter. And so our lives at that point, things like if she works late or she has to go on a business trip or, something comes up on the weekend, like, oh, you just go grind, or whatever, like whether that's for work or a hobby or anything. All of a sudden, there's now a major calculus that has to happen around that. And so, like for Acquired, like for us, I'm sure it's the same for you. You can do an infinite amount of research. At a certain point, we got to call it. Like the deadline of like, we're recording today, like you got to call it. And in the past, I could do things like, hey, I'm busy with other stuff or just lazy or whatever. Like I can always cram at the end. Like I can't do that anymore. We're like, we have a wonderful nanny. She works from 8 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. 4 days a week and 8 a.m. to 2:30 on Fridays. That's my work time.
Wow.
Ain't nothing else going to happen outside of those hours. Like that, you're limited and boxed in. So, for me at least, and I've observed this with so many friends too, once those constraints get put on you, you just don't, and I don't want to say people have different experience. For me, I don't have time to pretend to be interested in other things, to, dull the sharper edges of my personality. Like the only way, the natural way, and I think the only way that really works to function in the world as a parent is to just like let go of all of that, or at least the only way that works for me. And so the consequence of that is like you just become. I became way more comfortable with who I am and way less apologetic for who I'm not.
Wow.
And and I've just observed this with a lot of friends too. So that's my pet theory. Stuff like obviously I talk a lot. Like I do a lot of research. I like to expound on things. You're sitting here nodding. Obviously, listeners, you probably are too. I used to be embarrassed about that. Now I'm just like, nah, whatever. Like it works for me. That's helped build our business. Like I don't have any time to feel guilty or apologetic about that anymore.
Wow, that's so fat. Why did you feel guilty about that?
That's a good question. It's not the most obviously polite or like kind quality to just like talk a lot and rabbit hole on esoteric topics like in dinner table conversation. Some people would be really interested. Some people would not be. I remember I love telling this story. So the journey of Acquired episodes, we started as like a normal-ish length podcast and it's just got longer and longer and longer. And now we're at like 3.5, 4 hours per episode. That was starting to happen. And when we hit like 2 hours, my wife was like, I always remember it. It was on our Tesla episode that we did in 2018. And I told her it was going to be 2 hours and she was like, who the F do you think you are? Like, who is going to listen to you and Ben for 2 hours? Like, why are they going to give you their life for 2 hours? I was like, I mean, you have a good point. Like, you know, and then it ended up being our biggest episode ever to that point. And then every time we go longer and deeper, it's bigger. And but I think that's because there's like the magic of the internet. There's a subset of people out there who care about this and they dig it. And then there's just a lot of people who don't and they don't listen, and that's fine. So in you know, non-podcast company, I would try and be conscious of that. Now I'm just like, you know, but I don't have time for that.
That's funny that parenting made that realization more clear to you. You mentioned you knew your wife for 15 years before having a child. Do you think that was the right time? Would life have been more joyous, or would you have come to these realizations faster had you had a child earlier in your life?
Well, we wanted to have children earlier.
Understood.
We had all fertility journeys are unique, and as was ours. So we had started the process to try to have children, which, you know, you start the same way everybody else has started in human history. Probably 3.5 years before we actually had our daughter.
Understood.
And what we kind of by accident, half by accident, half we knew and just didn't focus on before, discovered is that both Jenny and I have genetic cancer mutations. So I have a thing called Lynch syndrome, which, at least in men, expresses itself as a strong predisposition to colon cancer. So I have to have colonoscopies every year, even though I'm 38 years old and I've had that since my mid-20s. It's fine. Like, my life expectancy is normal. I just never even thought of it. It's a genetic thing. And we found out that my wife has BRCA, which is a predisposition to breast cancer in women. And that's a lot scarier. So she gets screened every 6 months. You know, fortunately, she's been fine. But, you know, it's this is what folks may vaguely remember a number of years ago. Angelina Jolie had her breast removed. So a lot of women choose to just have their breast prophylactically removed to reduce the risk of breast cancer if they have it. So Angelina Jolie has BRCA. When we found that out, we'd already started the trying process, and we were like, okay, wait, hit pause. We got to think about what this means for our children. Like, if we pass those mutations on, especially if we were to pass both of them on to a child, you know, it's not something we wanted to do. Anyway, long-winded story. I like telling that, though, because all this world of genetic testing, even for adults, is relatively new. And most people don't do it. But it's like, so if you have these mutations, is very important to know, because then you can get screened and, like, you know, have appropriate care and not, you know, not develop cancers and not know about it. So,
wow. Thank you for sharing. How do you go about getting that screening?
It's, you know, these days, 23andMe screens for it. That's how we found out with my wife. I had been after her to do 23andMe for a couple of years. And then when we started trying, she was finally like, okay, you know, I'll do it. You know, we're thinking about family planning, and it popped up that she had BRCA, and, like, we didn't know, nobody in her family knew. And obviously plenty of her family members, you know, had it in the past. Fortunately, none of the current generation do except for her. But yeah, it's so easy. Like, 23andMe screens for a lot of this stuff, as do other off-the-shelf consumer services. You spit in a tube and then you find out. It's very easy.
Gotcha. That's very cool. Good to know.
Anyway, so to your original question, though, I don't know the answer. I can think about it, of whether we, you know, what life would have been like if we had had children younger. I will say one thing that I'm very, very grateful for, and I know Jenny is too, is that we met so young. We were, gosh, I was 20 when we met, and she was 17 or 18. Well, she was probably 17 when we met. No. Anyway, doesn't matter.
18's better for the story.
18's better. And we were in college. She was a freshman and I was a junior. Gotcha. Like, it was fine. And we didn't start dating until she was past 18. Not that it matters. But we grew up together. You know, we were kids. Like, we were kids when we met. And, like, so we've had an experience growing up together. And, like, when we met, we were so much more malleable, and, like, we have shaped each other in a way that I think if we had, obviously people meet later in life and have great relationships and whatnot, but, like, I just know, like, if we had met later, you get more hardened in your ways, especially after you have kids. Then you're just like, ain't nothing changing here about me. Or at least it's very hard. And that could be I think that maybe it would be harder to like build a relationship with somebody when you're already so set. So we're both very actively grateful for that time together. I don't know, like it's impossible to say how life would have been different if we had kids younger. But I'm so glad we have a child now and hopefully more in the future.
Yes. What have you learned about great relationships from studying so many great entrepreneurs?
Ooh. Well, the great, I think most of the great partnerships, I'm trying to think of great partnerships that we've studied in companies. I think by and large, there tends not to be like a lot of drama in them. I'm thinking of Akio Morita and Masaru Ibuku, the co-founders of Sony. Who else? Well, Woz and Jobs, there was quite a lot of drama. I think it was impossible to avoid with Steve Jobs. I never hear about a lot of drama between Larry and Sergey. We actually haven't covered Google on the show.
Wow. Can't wait to listen to that one.
Yeah. It's weirdly about Google. We don't know what the right time, like we like to wait until there's like okay, we can now really tell the story. And it's not obvious in my mind right now what the story of Google is, even though it's a 25-year-old company, 30-year-old company. Anyway, I think the partnerships that really make for great companies, I do think tend to just be like they last for a very long time. Whether there's clearly defined roles or it's more of a hive mind thing, I think that can change, or that's more fluid. But there's just not a lot of like, there's not like fighting that goes on a lot, or conflict. But most of the great companies are not partnerships; they're dictatorships. So I think it's pretty rare actually in the context of a company. I think David Senra talks about this a lot on the Founders Podcast, and I've thought about this when he and I chat. Most of the people that build these huge companies are insane. Like I think Senra puts it as like they are the Genghis Khans of our world, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. Like it's we're now at a stage with Acquired, which is so cool. We couldn't imagine. We get to interview some of these people. Because mostly, like, I think the core of what our show is our storytelling episodes, just me and Ben. We also do interviews because of what we do on the storytelling. We get access to do some interviews. So we do that. We interviewed Daniel Ek recently.
Spotify CEO.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Oh, Daniel's amazing. He's funny because he's Swedish. So he's got like the Swedish, but he's also got that killer in him underneath the Swedish exterior. It's not out yet, but it will be when this show comes out. We interviewed Dara Khosrowshahi, the CEO of Uber. Wow. We got like a bunch of this stuff now. And like when we sit down with these people, there's the interview itself, but then there's also the like everything that happens around it, and the security teams, the pressure, it's you really, I think if you're running a company like that, you really gotta want it. You gotta want to dominate the world like innately in a way that like I don't have, like I want to tell histories, like I don't want to like dominate, but I think not everybody, there are more, gentle-handed CEOs out there, but not a lot. Like they're the Genghis Khans of our modern world.
Wow. They got that killer gene in them. But it's interesting because I wonder, Michael Ovitz said something when he was on your show about how the stars would need multiple people and they would cycle through the people around them. And that to me, because when people are with people for too long, they find problems with them. And for me, that struck as like so disheartening in a way, because I was like, what does that mean for relationships and for partnerships for a long time? Like, will you inherently just get sick of somebody that you spend a lot of time with? How do you think about that?
Ooh. I think there's when you were talking about that dynamic, it made me think of do you watch Seinfeld?
I've
Yeah.
seen many, many
Oh,
episodes.
it's so great. It's such a great show. I don't watch a lot of TV, but I'll go back and watch old Seinfeld episodes. Like, it's just genius. Anyway, Jerry, the character, not necessarily, I don't know if it's Jerry, the real person or not, but Jerry, the character, this is like a trope for him, like with his girlfriends. He can't stay with it because he finds something wrong with them. It's like, oh, she scratches her head at a weird angle. It's just like, come on, man. These little things like, she eats too much cereal, like, or say, like something like that, and that's like, it touches on such a core part of human behavior, like you're talking about. And I think this is one of many, a small one of many reasons why I'm so glad Jenny and I met young and grew up together. Of like, again, like we talk about celebrity, like we're niche micro celebrities, right? But if I were out there dating right now, like it would just be a very different dynamic than when we were little college kids. and so I think you can I think as some of these people get elevated, and we're talking about the Genghis Khans of the world, that you get some of that behavior of like, oh, these people are great, they're helping me, but like, they scratch their head a little weird, and then you cycle through them. Whereas, I think true partnerships, relationships, great one, like you love people either despite or because of their flaws, because everybody is flawed. Everybody is deeply flawed. And you're just like, okay, like, I know what your flaws are and I love you anyway. And we create something, better than the two of us by being together.
That's really well said. How do you and Ben, your co-host on Acquired, have that dynamic?
We totally have that dynamic, like 100%. I'm sure he deeply knows my flaws, deeply, more than anybody except maybe more than Jenny. I mean, like, honestly, these days we spend more time with each other than we do our spouses. But there is that, like, and I know his flaws too, but I don't really care about them. Like, it's just like, we build this thing together, and it's like, there's zero question in my mind, and I don't think any in his either, that like, actually we've talked about this explicitly. If like one of us tried to do what we do on our own, it wouldn't be even near 50% of what it is. Like, it would be 0% of what it is. Like, the magic happens because of our relationship and the work that we each put into it in our different roles. But like a huge, like what's the word in chemistry? Like a reactive agent or something like that, I think, of the show is the magic of our chemistry. Like, if it were just me reading a history script or Ben doing analysis, like, I don't know, that doesn't sound very compelling, but like, it's the two of us coming together. There's just like, that's the most valuable thing to both of us. And so honestly, there are very, very few I can't think of a single like fight or argument we've had. Like, what it is too is that we both feel like there are plenty of times where one of us will say something like, hey, I think we should consider doing XYZ. That's different. Maybe that involves a change of the other person making. Maybe often it's just something we do together. We always are like, yeah, cool. Like, if you want to do it, I'm in, like, because this whole thing, we don't have shareholders, we don't have stakeholders. This whole thing works because we do what we want to do. So like, if you want to do it, I'm in, and so that's the approach that we always have. Like, I can't think, like, a perfect example. When my dumb idea, when we changed the show to adapting, Ben and I never had a fight about that. I'm sure Ben had concerns. I know he had concerns, but he was like, all right, man, let's do it, and that actually, I'm so glad we're on this topic. I'm sorry for expounding for so long.
No, please do.
I think that's so rare and valuable because I've been in other partnerships where that's not the case, where your ideas or desires that people have are put through the ringer, shall we say, and accepted or rejected. Based, like, the other party or parties feel like they have the right to reject what other members of the partnership want to do, and they do it. And I can't, like, that just creates such, I contrast that dynamic versus what like Ben and I have, or what Jenny and I have in our marriage. Is like, hey, if one of us wants to do something, we're gonna do it, And like, it may not be a good idea. We may change and be like, hey, that was pretty dumb, But like, ultimately, like, these partnerships exist to like further what we want to do. And so if somebody wants to do something, we're gonna do it.
Yeah, I think a good partnership makes you more you.
Yeah.
And helps highlight the strengths of your own personality and helps understand your own flaws in a easier context to understand.
Yep.
Which is really cool. And it sounds like you have that in multiple places in your life, which is incredibly beneficial.
It is. It's a really hard thing to do, I think, if there are other stakeholders. If you're in a company, right? Like, you have shareholders, you have employees, so like, or you're like a venture capital partnership, you have investors. Like, it's the it gets a lot more complicated. There's something just so pure about like a partnership that's just a part, or for you and your own, this is you. Obviously, by default, you do what you want to do because it's just you.
Yeah. One of the reasons why I think Acquired is so successful, other than the research, the dynamic between you two, is your smiley nature. That's one thing that people will notice, like, almost immediately from listening to it, I feel like, is how happy and excited it feels like you are to talk about the things you're talking about. And my friend Danny Desatnik, we were going back and forth, and I was telling him that I was having you on the show, and he was like, ask him about why he's so smiley. And I'm curious about this as well. What do you think that indicates, and why are you so smiley?
Oh, okay. Well, I'll start with actually answering your question. I have another fun thought that I think about with this. I think it's just innate. I got to take one of the other courses I got to take in college was Danny Kahneman was a professor at Princeton.
Wow.
And he now lives in Berkeley out here in the Bay Area. He's retired, but he was a professor at Princeton. And so I, unfortunately, by the time I got around to taking his course, he had just retired. So it was the first year that he was not teaching it, but it was his course about his research. And this might have been before Thinking Fast and Slow came out and all the he was starting to be well known, but it wasn't yet Danny Kahneman is Danny Kahneman. And a lot of his research, if I remember it right, and I remember the course right, was that I remember one of his experiments was people moving to California. Like, everybody thinks you move to California, it's going to be sunshine and rainbows, and this is the land of milk and honey, and it is. Like, that is all true. But people revert to their base rates very quickly of happiness. Like, almost never will moving to California or the metaphorical moving to California make you happier. You just kind of are. And my base rate, you wake up on a 1 to 10, every morning. Like, I wake up on a 9 every morning. That's just my base rate. So I think that's why. Well, that's part of why. The other part of why is most, if not the two aspects of my life that I think are the most important, my family and my career, I'm doing what I want to do. There's nothing I would change. I've architected it. I get to do these amazing episodes, all this research, which I love doing, have these amazing experiences. And I do handoff with my kid every night. I'm spending multiple hours a night just with this little, little chaos agent that I love so much. Of course I wake up at a 9 out of 10. So I think that's my answer to your question. You said, though, it comes through in the podcast. I totally agree. This is something that I've thought for a long time about podcasting. I think a lot of people still don't realize who aren't doing it. It is the most intimate medium. It's so different from text. Also, video too. Obviously, we're doing video here, and this will be on YouTube, and we're on YouTube too. But people who are native YouTubers that are highly produced video, you lose the human element. Whereas podcasting is a conversation happening in your ear, and vocal inflections, emotions, they all come right through. And it makes such a difference. Back to the parenting, a crazy thing that I discovered in parenting a little baby, even very, very young, is the transfer of emotions. So whatever I'm feeling when I'm, trying to get the kid to sleep or like, so whatever, like it transfers. Like if I'm stressed, if my mind is elsewhere, or if I'm present and I'm calm, like even way before language developed, like she would pick up on that, and I think podcasting is the same. Like, we're all wired that way.
Why would humans be any different than babies?
We're not. Right? We're the same way.
We are babies.
We think we're different, but we're not. And so like the cadence of voice, the intonation, the excitement, it immediately translates directly into people's brains because they're wearing AirPods walking around,
Yeah, podcasting, it makes me think about it as like the most human form of communication that we have today. Like when I think about a YouTuber, I think of something highly produced and in your face. And I've never like understood why I don't want to be a YouTuber, but I do want to be a podcaster. It's like something to the human element of it. Yep. It's like, I don't want to lose my soul.
I 100% agree. I'm actually curious. So, okay, how do you think about this dynamic for your show? And B, how do you think about YouTube and video?
So, I mean, how I think about this dynamic in my show is like, I try to be as present as possible. I try to be as in the moment and try to be as content personally away from the show because I know everything I do away from the show comes out in the show, whether or not I wanted to or not. I've noticed in the times of my life when I've wanted to.
You had a fight with a friend last night? That's coming through on the show.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you noticed the same thing?
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's crazy. And so it makes you much more conscious of the things you're doing as you're doing them. How do I think about YouTube and video? I'm like, well, YouTube and video.
That's one of the things I just want to say a compliment for you on the show. Like you're here with your, pad of, your legal pad, not legal pad, your spiral bound notebook and, your pen, like, your phone isn't here, like, it's just like, these are little things and obvious things, but most people don't do them, like you're here, you're present. Like it makes such a difference.
Yeah. I mean, have you ever had a conversation with somebody on their phone? It's like everyone has had that experience.
Those are most of our conversations in the human existence these days, right?
Yeah. And that is why podcasting to me feels so like home.
Yeah.
Because you're connecting with another human being and actually connecting with them. Whereas you wouldn't do that if you guys, even 10 minutes in, you pulled up a phone or so.
If we were just getting a coffee right now, this would be a different experience.
Yes, way different. And so I like yearn for that. And I think that all humans do yearn for that connection with another human being and that undivided attention to another person because you yourself gain something from that.
Yeah. And that's what we can give our audience.
Yes. And that's what somebody is getting when they are listening. Mm-hmm. The second question was around YouTube. And video. I think that it's undeniable in the sense of like it does bring in people. It does bring in new eyeballs. It does bring in like you could do clips, you can do all this stuff, but
the algorithm alone.
Yeah, the algorithm of it. But the truth is like you can not only get away with, you can grow by having amazing audio conversations.
Yep.
And sometimes I wonder if I spend too much time with David Senra, if all this stuff is the added production that I don't actually need.
Right. Senra famously doesn't do video at all.
Yes. And he's like, look how much I'm saving time and energy and money. And I respect that for what he's trying to do. But I also know that like the show wouldn't be what it is today. I wouldn't be able to get some of the guests that I've had I not been doing video on it. So
yeah, it's to me, this is the big challenge. The big open question right now in our industry and for folks like us is like, especially 'cause we started in the audio only medium and we are still 95% of our audience and focus is on audio, but it's undeniable that video and YouTube is incredibly important. You're living it right now. You don't need to look any farther than Lex and, everybody else to know how important it is. But it's a different experience. It's the production cost and complexity is way higher. Also, the actual experience is a little different too.
Totally. My whole thing is like, if you really believe in the product, which you should, is like, maybe it's so, why not bring it to more people? Is the idea. And I guess the rebuttal to that would be, well, if it takes away from just the audio experience, then you shouldn't do it.
Yep.
But to me, I'm like, oh man, there should be 1,000 times more people listening to Acquired. There should be 1,000 times more people listening to Founders.
And you're so too. Absolutely.
So thank you. But if that's the case, then why not put it in as many mediums as possible? And I often think about like the peak of my show might not be audio or video. It might be like through virtual reality of some sort. Mm-hmm. My friend Zach Pogrob and I talk about that. Like, we're doing this for decades. So if that's the case, what's the next medium? It's likely that the mediums that are current have been taken by the Rogan, the Lexes. Okay, so if that's the case, then you're going to have to think about the next medium, right, which is virtual reality, which is like a hard thing right. to think about.
Oh, man. Coming in 2024 with Apple.
Yeah.
We'll see. But that's such a good point, too. I think you talked about this with Seth Godin, I think, right? Of like, I can't remember the exact nature of what you guys said, but I was thinking, listening to it, is like mediums change, but the product that you are producing like should not. Like what is the Danny Miranda show? It's not a podcast, it's not a video, it's this. Yeah. It's this conversation that we're having and that you're having with hundreds of other people. Whatever mediums you need to do that in, like the human demand is for like the conversation.
Yes. And that's why I found it so fascinating that Oprah viewed her life mission and purpose as not the Oprah Winfrey show that ran for 25 years, which is like a hard thing for people to grasp.
Yeah.
It's like, I think her actual life mission and purpose, as she would define it, is like giving people that experience of presence and connection and helping people understand themselves.
Yeah.
And that goes way beyond a show and elevating the consciousness of humanity through that process. And so, yeah, that's something that I think about a lot. It's like, it's not just the podcast. It's something beyond that. And for you, it's like, it's teaching and storytelling about some of the greatest things. That goes beyond a podcast. And if you think about that beyond a podcast, that could be like live events. That could be you creating a theme park of like history.
That would be amazing.
Right?
We have a running joke on the show about the Acquired Museum. The fictional Acquired Museum of like whenever there's an artifact of something that comes up in a story, we're like, oh yeah, we should get that and put it in the Acquired Museum.
Yeah.
We should have an Acquired Museum. That'd be fun.
Yeah. And so I think that like for a creator or entrepreneur or a person listening, it's like the more you do a thing and the better you get at it, the more you understand the core ethos of what you're actually creating, which allows you to expand beyond and build it.
And I think that's also, especially for creators, but any kind of product and company, like that's such an important insight, is like, what is it's not a podcast, it's not, it doesn't matter that this is a podcast or a YouTube or whatever. It's like, for you, it's this conversation. For us, it's a storytelling, for Senra, it's motivation. I love it. He talks about, right, like, that he should sell an alarm clock app of, David Senra yelling in your ear when you wake up.
That would be great.
Yeah, but that's what it is that you make. It's not a podcast. Like,
yeah, absolutely. I also want to talk about podcasts and how you are giving an opportunity for so many more people to listen and hear these stories than ever was possible before. It's like people would get this information in a book, and the total addressable market for book readers is a lot less than the total addressable market for people who will learn about information on a startup or something that they're interested in. And so how do you think about that? Like, we're entering into a new frontier, and how amazing is that you get to be the person that is shepherding. You're like one of the first authors in the world of this new medium, truly.
Yeah, it's good. Well, it's not me and Ben singular. It's all of us collectively doing this. It's our crew. And that's one of the little sidebar, but one of the things that's so awesome about our part of the world, at least for now, and I don't see it changing anytime soon, is it's so collaborative. Like, we're all rooting for each other.
Yes.
Like, this is a industry and mindset of abundance, not scarcity.
It's crazy. There's so many people who will help each other out, because I think we all realize that it's a rising tide right now, and the podcasting medium as a whole is something that's coming up together.
Yep, totally. It's the My First Million guys. It's all like, we're all when one of us succeeds, we're all like, we're pumped. We're pumped for each other. And that's so awesome. And not like
special time.
It's not like venture capital. Let me tell you that.
Yeah. But maybe it was like that for venture capital
in
the 70s.
It was.
80s,
And so
right?
it's awesome to be part of this magic era. I think about this, Ben and I think about this a lot, like the book thing. Partially because we're constantly thinking about like, should we write a book? We're getting pitched on like if we do it, the reasons to do it are not to spread the knowledge. The knowledge spreads so much more through the podcast. But yeah, you said an interesting thing. The market for, or the reach of podcasts versus the reach of people of book readership is exponentially higher. This is one of the crazy things about books. So there's so many reasons why books gate knowledge. One, you got to find them. Two, you got to buy them, which, those are big gates for a lot of people, both of those. Maybe that's financial resources, but even just the friction of buying something, no matter how much money you have, is friction. But then the biggest friction gate is you got to read it. Yeah. Like, the actual, I've heard various, people in the industry say different stats, but so don't take this as gospel, but like in my mind, in, sort of the aggregate, like conversion rate of a purchased book to being read is like, I don't know, 10 to 20%, So like even for the biggest books out there,
if you sell 1 million copies and 200,000 people actually read the full thing,
right?
It's like,
well, any given Acquired episode, more people listen to that than, and how many books sell 1 million copies? Like not a lot. This proliferation of knowledge that's happening with podcasting and YouTube too is, you're right. It's totally unique in the history of the world.
And on that point, it's like a new market is getting created specifically in business podcasts and business information, where the business people are becoming celebrities in their own right. And Elon Musk, I guess, is the best example of this at a full spectrum.
Right.
Steve Jobs maybe before.
Right.
But it's like now you're starting to see that like almost business people are starting to become the way that athletes were when ESPN started to be around.
Totally. Steve Jobs and Warren Buffett and Charlie do a little bit, associated with Warren and Charlie, were early versions of this, but they were so limited. The only way that they could reach mass audiences were either through company events, the Berkshire shareholder meeting, or when Steve would do a keynote, or through shareholder letters. Like that, they didn't have the megaphones right there. You contrast that with, whatever you think of Elon, good, bad, or indifferent, like he has the direct distribution and megaphone with no, think about the process that has to go into an Apple keynote or a Berkshire Hathaway shareholder meeting. Yeah, they are and were saying what they think on stage, and it was their vehicle to deliver things. But like the barriers to that happening, even for Steve Jobs, were huge. Like, and now it's all gone.
Yeah. And you're creating the business heroes that people are going to be thinking about. How do you take that responsibility?
Oh, it's, that's I don't think about it too much. I should probably think about it more. So we, Ben and I choose episodes based on our interests. And we don't record in advance. We don't have like a bunch of episodes in the can that we're waiting. It's like a just-in-time production line, because we only make one of the story episodes a month. We finish an episode. We usually take a week of like, recover. And during that week, we start texting each other like, what do you want to do next? What do you want to do next? But you raise a good point. What we choose to cover, we are elevating. And we don't put a lot of thought into it beyond just what our interests are. And the reason for that is kind of like we've been talking about here, the excitement, the enthusiasm, like it's got to be authentic, because if we're not excited about doing an episode, that's not going to be a very good episode. But yeah, we probably should think a little more about, this really came home for us this past fall, in whenever that was, November 2022, when FTX blew up. We had interviewed SBF on the show. And that was an interview, not a storytelling episode about FTX, but still, like, we were part of the media, conglomerate, media industry that was elevating him and enabling a giant fraud. Like, yeah. But I worry, though, if I think about it too much and we think about it too much, we'll get too in our own heads about it,
Yeah, that makes sense. How do you think about figuring out the frauds from the real stuff?
I have another theory about this. So as far as we know, SBF is the only fraud that we have had on or covered on the show, as far as we know.
Yeah.
And it's hard to think of bigger frauds than that. So that was a pretty big fail on our part. But whether they're frauds or just like episodes that we would have regret doing, maybe interviews, because that's more of a, there's this, and my mom always used to say growing up, water seeks its own level. And we have been in touch with plenty of other businesses and founders who something would subsequently happen that had we done the episode, we would have regretted it.
Wow.
And in 95% of the cases, the episodes don't happen. They just like don't come together. And I think there's a little bit of something to this of like, I don't know. I don't think it's because we ask like hard hitting questions or anything like that, but, because I've wondered this myself, like how have we gotten so lucky so far that we only have one? And again, granted, it was a bad one, but I think there is an element of this of like, if something's a little too shady or there's not enough substance there, that person ends up shying away from coming on.
I think about it in terms of relationships and your level of consciousness. So David Hawkins has this pyramid that I've seen before, which is like at the top is like 1,000 enlightenment, and at the bottom is like fear-based emotions. And the idea that I've been thinking about is like the people who come on the show are often very similar to the level of consciousness that I'm operating with at any given level. And similar to relationships and friendships. It's like, it's very hard to be in a relationship or in a friendship with somebody who is basing all of their decisions and emotions on fear when you're operating in love.
Yeah,
and
totally.
Because it just doesn't interact in that same way. Like it's hard to relate. It's hard to connect with them because you're looking at
the vibes don't mesh.
That's it. And I'm sure that when you say that, that's what triggers for
I think that happens.
Yeah.
Also a lot of luck involved too. But like, yes, I think that does exist to a certain extent.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to cover for this episode? Or we've covered a lot. Anything you'd like to say? Anything you'd like to cover before we go to a close? And I ask you the final question about the challenge.
The challenge. Oh boy. Two things. One, I do genuinely want to thank you too. We're just talking about vibes. Like, you got such a good vibe. Like, thank you for inviting me on. This is so fun. I just love doing stuff like this and doing it with fellow creators, right? Like, we are in this magical moment in our industry where there's so much abundance. It's a rising tide. We all are genuinely pumped for one another when we succeed. Yeah. And so it's so cool to do this with you. And you have that mindset, you know? One. Two, the only other thing I would say that I this feels like as good as any a medium to do it. You said you have a lot of younger folks who listen. One thing I always like to say, I was just I did a talk at Google for their associate product manager program last week. And the question came up there. These are all people that are 1 to 2 years out of college or in this prestigious program at Google, blah, blah, on this track. And they sort of asked for career advice and whatnot. And I was like, what I said to them, and I like to say is, when I was at that phase, doing investment banking, getting into venture capital, was doing all the things that seemed like the right track. And in retrospect, I got to a certain point on that track, but any real success I've had has come from something completely off the track, completely off the rails. So keep that in mind, one. And then the other thing I think, especially I was looking at them, and they're like in such this moment in life, and it took me back, especially when I was in business school. And there's so much weight in business school that I felt and my classmates felt of like the job that you get after business school. That's like setting you on this path. It's so important. It's not important. Like, it's not, the specifics of what you are doing are not important. What matters is, are you broadly on an upward trajectory? Are you feeling fulfilled? Are you finding something, working towards something that like you're going to be happy doing? Like, if those things are true, like, it doesn't matter what you're doing. Like, there's just so much weight that gets put on these individual decisions early in life. And like, it's the broader context that matters way more than the specifics.
Yeah, especially since what really helped put this in line for me was the compounding nature of things and the doubling of like your 10th to 11th year doing a thing are going to be way more important and way more valuable than the first to second. And that's why picking something that you actually enjoy doing is so, so important. And let the first part of your career or life be exploring the different things so that you can actually figure out the thing to double down on and triple down on. And then the year 10, 11, 12 will be so magical. So
there's a really, really great tangible, visceral illustration of this, which is Marques Brownlee, the MKBHD YouTube channel. And Marques, he's amazing. And the channel is amazing. And I often look up to him and them and what they're farther along the path. You know, I think he was in high school when he started, maybe middle school.
Yeah.
It was like early YouTube, let's call it 2011, 2012, something like that. And now they're 4 or 5 years ahead on the compounding curve than where we are at Acquired, and even more years ahead of you.
Yeah.
The difference year to year in their business size and scale, their team, the production quality, the impact of what they're doing every single year grows so much. We got to, when we were in New York, we got to go visit his studio a couple weeks ago and see like how they make this stuff. I mean, there's many millions of dollars of investment, capital investment and equipment that goes into that. And that's like doubling every year, you know? So like, just you look at that and you're like, wow, his year 13 to 14 is as big as his years 0 to 13.
Wow. Yeah, that is so true. And that's why I say all the time about going inward and understanding yourself, because Marques understood himself at a young age to know that that's what he would want. And you understand yourself when you start Acquired and you're enjoying it and you're, okay, let's double down on this. Let's do it more. It's like, you need to find the place that you yourself could see yourself doing something similar in year 8, 7, 9, 10, 12, 13. I get so excited about this because it's so true, right? And I think I spent the first, from 15 years old to 25 years old thinking about what other people would value and how can I play their game. But all the success, like you said, all the joy, all the fulfillment came when I started playing my own game, which was this podcast. So even though it might be difficult to the people around you, when you start playing your own game, it's worth it. And thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
What can we leave people with as a way of a challenge to help them live the best possible version of their own lives?
Remind me again, this challenge for the audience, not challenge for you.
Yes. I'll take a challenge too.
Right,
I love a challenge from you.
Have you done any episodes just about you?
A few. Here and there.
Okay.
Sometimes I'll have people interview me.
Yeah. Okay. So you do it. Okay.
David Perel interviewed me, episode 305 or 306.
Okay. So you've done it recently.
Recommend.
That was going to be my challenge. Otherwise, I'm like,
thank you.
I love this. Closing segment that you do. And I really had to think about this. I even just took a pause here. Now we broke recording for a few minutes for me to like think about this. Okay. So my challenge to all of you listening is, if you listen to Danny's show or you listen to any other podcasts and you think it's really cool and I would love to do that, my challenge to you is do it. Go start a podcast, YouTube channel, whatever medium you want to do. If you think doing something like this or your own kind of thing, just do it and make 5 episodes and see where it goes.
Yeah. I think that there's something so magical about understanding the things that you consume because there's a reason why you spent the time to do that. I remember listening to like you you read a bunch of shareholder letters or something along those lines. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it's like there's a reason why you were so interested in entrepreneurship and did it for fun and read the stuff that you did. Like there's something there.
Yeah.
And I don't think we spend a lot of time thinking about why we consume the things we consume.
Yeah. And I think there's also there's an interesting, we've been talking about where we are in this magic moment in the creator industry writ large. I think for people who are not yet in it, but think they might want to get in it, that I think there might be a bit of a Mark Andreessen effect right now. And I'm referring to, Mark had this amazing quote when after he founded Netscape and was being interviewed, this is back in the 90s, of he was like, I almost didn't move to Silicon Valley because I thought it was over. I thought I'd missed everything. I thought everything had already happened.
That's how I felt when I started podcasting in 2020.
Yes. And so I think a lot of people who might want to start a podcast or a YouTube channel feel like, oh man, Danny's already huge, Acquired's huge, Marquez is huge. Like there's no room for me anymore. Not the case. Yeah. Definitely not the case. You got to work harder now than we did. It was even easier it was easier when you started a couple years ago. It was even easier when we started. It was even easier when Marquez started. But like, it's not closed. The door is still wide open.
Yeah, I think what helped me understand this was David Senra's comparison with the NBA or the NFL. It's like if you played baseball, basketball, or football in 1970, and then in 1980 you started playing, like that's okay.
Yeah.
Like it was harder to win and be an NBA player in 1980 than it was in 1970.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean it's a long way to go for it to be what it is going to be.
NBA is a great example, right? Like if anybody listening is an aspiring NBA player, far be it from me to crush your dreams, but like the NBA is so much farther on that spectrum now. Like if you want to be an NBA superstar, like, wow, that's really hard.
Yeah.
If you want to be a superstar creator, it's infinitely easier than becoming LeBron James.
That's true. And also it'll probably be a lot harder 30 years from now.
Yes. It will get to a point where it is as hard as becoming LeBron James.
Yeah.
But we're not there yet.
Which is interesting because we've almost reached that point with like television and radio in some respects. It's almost impossible to be a radio star or a television star. Those mediums are so extrapolated with like, they're so oversaturated with people, but podcasting and YouTube videos they're on the come up and rise and growing every year.
Yeah. So, all right. That's my challenge.
Thank you so much for the time, your attention, your wisdom, your energy, all such beautiful things. Acquired podcast. I recommend starting with Michael Ovitz's CAA episode. The Taylor Swift one, also incredible. Anywhere else we should send people to continue the conversation with you?
That's it. Acquired. You can find us on any podcast player, Spotify. Otherwise, we are on YouTube. Give us feedback on how you think about what you think of our video content. And yeah, love to have you be part of the community.
Thank you so much for spending the time here today. So appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.